Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thanks for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. Today, we are turning our sights to the great state of Alabama, where there's a lot going on, and we're going to meet one of the people behind a lot of the stuff. My guest today is Kevin Burns, who's a co-founder and a director of the Sand Mountain Cooperative Education Center, and also working towards building up an Alabama State Center. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Bret. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely a pleasure. So I want to give a shout out before we get into all the great things you're working on. Our mutual friend, Haley Gibson, who's with Threaded Fasteners. I guess you've been working with Haley down in Alabama. And Haley, a couple of weeks ago, sent an email out to me, you, and one of your colleagues and said, hey, you guys should chat. And you and I had a great conversation. So I wanted to have you come on and talk about everything. But first, I just want to thank Haley for introducing us.
Yeah, absolutely. My thanks to Haley. She's been helping us open some doors in Mobile, which is really exciting to get down there. We are looking at a statewide presence, and Haley's a really important part of that, and hopefully a statewide tour coming up.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about the Sand Mountain Cooperative Education Center, which, by the way, before we get into it for our listeners, you're doing something that I haven't come across before. And I've been doing the podcast since 2017, and I thought this was like, wow, really cool stuff that you're working on. Why don't you, and we do like to open our podcast with the EO aha moment, but before we get there, why don't you just give a very brief elevator talk about what Sand Mountain Cooperative Education Center is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Sand Mountain Cooperative Education Center, we started and our first programs were youth leadership programs. So we actually run a camp called Lamplight Summer Camp, and that's where we teach ownership skills to kids 12 to 18 in rural Alabama. So they run the camp with us, the daily operations of the camp. They have committees to do things like mediation, plan field trips, et cetera, and then they pass proposals together in what they dubbed the PAC meeting, which is kind of the highest decision-making body of the camp. So we started that in 2018, and our work, with the first camp actually being 2019, and our work has led us to think about how our kids, our students, can use these kinds of skills in adulthood. And I think for me personally, that led me in many ways to employee ownership.
I love that, Kevin, and got to tell you, I'm not even sure if when we first chatted a week or so ago, if I had shared with you, but from like 89 to 92, I actually ran a summer day camp that was just a general purpose summer day camp. Yeah. I think that what you're doing is so cool.
That's awesome. Where was the camp? We hadn't talked about that.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was a community center day camp. I was actually the children and youth director from, I think, about 89 till 92. And so I ran after school programs year round. And in the summer, we had an outdoor summer camp. We had an outdoor facility with probably about 125, 150 kids. That was just a great experience. But I had also learned that you can't necessarily support a family, with camp money was my experience. So had a great experience, absolutely loved it. I do want to talk more about your summer program, which is wonderful, and some things that you've expanded on before then. But first, Kevin, as you know, we like to open the podcast with our EO aha moment. It's not the moment you first heard about employee ownership, but a moment or a series of moments that led you to be like, aha, this could be transformative. Do you have an aha moment that you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So this would be, I met Daniel, my co-founder, at Teachers College at Columbia. That must have been 2015 or so. But shortly after we met, we started the idea for the camp. His grandfather had passed and left him this property, a little cabin that we actually lived in last year on Lake Gunnersville. And that's how we ended up building together the camp. And at the same time, I had started teaching in the Bronx. I taught social studies, 7th grade, and I ended up doing that for 6 years. And the first two and a half were the hardest years of my life. I mean, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. I think it's really shaped who I am. And I think I use the skills that I learned as an educator in everything that I do. I also miss that community in Creston and the Bronx dearly, but part of the thing that motivated me was always that this project, this camp, would grow. and would become bigger, and actually something that I wanted to do full time. It was always my passion. And we came to the point 2 years ago where we were ready to move to Alabama, which was always something that I had planned. And we were moving down, and we knew it partially to grow the camp, but we had always thought about, what does it mean for our campers and for the community after you've been through 4 or 5 years of camp? We do work very closely with a smaller group of kids for a long time, really working on those skills. And where do they go after? They just go into traditional employment, which is typically not going to value those skills that they've learned to work together to run an entire program or run an institution or organization. And had been thinking deeply about that question for a long time. And to be honest, when we moved down, we had the money for a year. We knew we wanted to grow the camp. We knew we wanted to do something bigger and help build institutions that would help with the economic situation in our area. It's one of the poorest counties in the United States, and to deal with the inequality. And at the very same time, my co-founder, Daniel, got a remote job with a company called Ginkgo Bioworks, which is publicly traded kind of biotech startup that's very successful, and they're transitioning to employee ownership. He got a job in their communications to help build a culture of ownership at the company, and he started reading just voraciously about employee ownership. And it opened my eyes to this idea that employee ownership can work at scale to address inequality. And I think that I had this feeling that, especially, and I didn't get to go, but they went to Mondragon in Spain and looked at the Basque Country and just how high the quality of life is there due to this enormous federation of employee-owned businesses, and really the kind of network effect that they have to be sustainable and grow long-term. We brought those experiences back in the reading, and the idea before we moved down to Alabama was like, I think we found the thing that we want to do. And I think it was eerie, I know, for him, because he got back to Northern Alabama, and it's hilly. It's like the foothills of Appalachia. It's incredibly green. And he was like, this looks almost like the Basque Country to me. It looks like, and the people, I think, are incredibly tough, very proud. And it felt like the thing that could work. And it's what we wanted to invest in. And we could picture our kids who have done these incredible things already, like we do an after school program as well. And they elected 2 weeks ago that if the point person, which is a kid, doesn't do the necessary steps to organize the meetup, it doesn't happen. And the first volunteer we had after they passed that proposal was 13-year-old. And I went on vacation last week and I forgot about it. And I came back and I looked at my phone and she was doing that. She's asking, wow, who's going to be there? This is going to be the shopping list this is going to be the activity. Who needs a ride? She's 13 and she lives 40 minutes away, probably, in just way out in the country. I mean, she was otherwise like very disconnected from kind of the closest town. And most people in our area are. Transportation was one of the primary challenges when we talked to the community about what we could provide, and we do. But I could picture these kids as employee owners, and the dignity and the, I think, excitement that comes with that, and also the ability to create a stable financial future for themselves and their families, which, in most cases isn't the case right now for most of them. So it felt like the right thing to do at the time.
I love that. I love that influences came from different directions, if you will. I love that your aha moment a little bit came vicariously through Daniel's experiences. And that also is very cool. It also reminded me about when you were speaking of the 13-year-old, ownership comes in many different forms. And candidly, on the podcast, we often talk in terms of share ownership, and capital structure and all that kind of thing. But we also talk about ownership in the workplace. And what a great example of, first of all, for you guys as the adult leaders to say, hey, if this is going to happen, it's because you're going to make it happen. And then to see the 13-year-old take ownership of making that program happen. And, I was in youth groups when I was in high school and whatnot, and went through the leadership of the youth groups, and absolutely am convinced that that kind of put me on the path of, when I got to be an adult, of knowing I can do leadership because I did it, as a senior in high school, president of the youth group and that kind of thing. So that is absolutely very cool and very wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree. For me, a lot of it had to do with just as an educator approaching it from kind of pedagogical models. So we started with a popular education model, which is very much about kind of social inquiry and allowing the community you're working with to drive that inquiry and where it's going to go. And also that inquiry should have a real world actionable impact at the end, right? You give people, you help people understand the problems around them, and then you give them the power to create a project that's going to address it and deal with that problem. And for me, it was really coming from that place, and through the experience of building that kind of educational model, realizing the power that ownership had as to craft, like you said, leaders or craft people. I mean, I felt it within myself. I think it makes sense to me, honestly, that I think like my experience with the employee ownership aha moment would be somewhat vicarious, because I've experienced it in myself, building our own nonprofit, moving to Alabama, you know what I mean, from New York, and I'm from Minnesota originally, but it's just things that I couldn't have imagined that I would have ever done, and a feeling, honestly, that I didn't think existed or had no kind of understanding or didn't think I would necessarily have access to. And really what that is kind of like, it's how you look at the world. I think when you feel ownership over something and you're building something, then you look at the world as a place that you can build in. And you understand that you can pick up the phone and just call people who know what they're doing, who have been through it before, and ask them questions and learn about it, and then try, and then go back to the drawing board. And I'm very lucky. I've got to work with many of my best friends. So that's a very, I think, like safe group and audience to work with, and some of the most talented and brilliant people I've ever met. But you go back to them and you talk about it and you try again. And I think that is an incredibly rewarding way to approach the world. And I think you get there through ownership of something. Whereas I think for many people who might not have that opportunity, the world can feel, and in many ways is, like, I think a kind of terrifying and oppressive place, but yeah, I think it comes down to getting that opportunity, and it can really change a lot about how you see things and how you operate.
So I had a question that I was going to introduce as being a complete tangent, but I found a way to bring some relevance to this conversation, which makes me happy. So the question that I was going to ask without any context is, what was the biggest cultural shift for you? I thought that here's a guy who's living in the Bronx, teaching, seventh graders in the Bronx, and you move to rural Alabama. And then you mentioned you're from Minnesota. Which was the biggest cultural shift from you, moving from Minnesota to New York City, or moving from New York City down to Alabama?
That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure, but I do have a funny story. I remember meeting my friend Zach, who runs the Automotive Free Clinic. And basically what they do is pay what you can or what you will car repair, which is amazing in Montgomery. And, as I think most Americans know, most people live, one car accident or problem away from serious debt and hardship. And so they help people with that. But anyway, I had to just shout out his work because it's really amazing. But Zach is just an incredible person, and he's from Alabama. He likes to call himself the Mad Redneck. And I remember when we started this, he was one of the first people we met down here, and that believed in us. I mean, Daniel's family's from here. That's the Alabama connection, really. But, one of the people we met kind of outside his immediate friends and family in this kind of work. And I remember when I first, probably a few years in, we'd done camp once or twice. And I'm like, man, I'm going to move down here eventually. Like, this is going to be a bigger thing. We're going to build on it. I want to do that. And he was just like, man, you can't do that. You can't move to Alabama. Like, you're not going to make it. He's like, I've seen so many Yankees move down here trying to do something good, and, they just leave after a year. Like, you can't do it.
Wow.
I was like, wow. Yeah. And then, a year goes by or two, And he's just like, man, you got to move down here, man. Like he goes, I'll be your cultural translator.
Love that. Absolutely. It's important to have community wherever you go.
I thought it was hilarious though, because to get back to your question, like my feeling was like, dude, I don't know how to tell you it's not that different. Like America is an enormous web of strip malls and highways. Like I'm pretty familiar with it, growing up in Minnesota. I cannot honestly tell you it's that enormously different, from Alabama. But I mean, when I moved to Guntersville, to rural Alabama, I was definitely a person of extremes. Like I lived in New York City for 11 years. I wanted the city. And then if I was going to leave, I wanted to live on a lake in a cabin in the country. So now I live in Birmingham. I'm reemerging into civilization.
I love that. And I guess the way that I made it relate in my mind is you probably saw, I don't know if this is some inherent bias coming through in my questions, but I imagine that you had experienced so many different things in New York City and even Minnesota that hadn't been brought to rural Alabama yet. And, I imagine that would have opened your eyes to need or potential or, we got an opportunity to do something. Let's figure out what to do.
Yeah, I mean, it was a couple of things. So number one, there was a really kind of interesting connection. We were at Teachers College, Columbia, and the seminary at Columbia is where this guy Miles Horton went, and he started the Highlander Folk Center, which is now the Highlander Research and Education Center. That was a huge inspiration for us as far as an educational model, and it's like very much based on the Danish folk schools, which he had gone to. But he's from Tennessee. The center was started in Tennessee. He's an Appalachian guy. And where we are in northern Alabama, it's like foothills of Appalachia. So we felt like we were reading about this guy and fascinated by his approach to education. At the very same time, Daniel's like, here's this opportunity with this piece of land in northern Alabama. And I felt like, so there was that connection. But I mean, I think on top of that, I saw an opportunity, which was I was very passionate about the idea. The way I see kind of the political divide in the United States is like urban and rural. And it felt like an opportunity to create a kind of unity between, working class people in rural and urban United States. And I think we're really excited because that was always part of the vision. I was really motivated to work with like rural kids. That was a really exciting opportunity for me originally. And, this year we're trying to start Lamplight Summer Camp in Birmingham. And I cannot wait to see what kind of, cross-pollination and collaboration could happen between the camps. And that camp might look very different. Our model is very much like not only the campers, but the community and the staff are going to determine what it's going to look like. But we know that they're going to be visiting each other. And I'm really excited about that opportunity. And to me, that employee ownership offers that as well. I think it's something that crosses a lot of divides. That's motivating people, that people understand. I think people want to own something. I think they understand that dignity. And I think that it can be a solution to a lot of struggle, that I think people share as well.
There is a universality to employee ownership where you talk to somebody who doesn't know anything about employee ownership, and I don't think this is regional or age or whatever, and you just say, how would things be different where you work if you were part owner of the company? And you just hear, oh my goodness, and a lot of folks, we need to work on the culture. We need to work on building the infrastructure of employee-owned companies because it doesn't just happen. But in terms of how to make things better, people can rattle off, just about in any position. What would you do if you were part owner?
Yeah.
This, and this.
Yep.
And a lot of times I'll use the restaurant industry just randomly of how to get food served better or how to, it's very practical on the front line kind of stuff of what they would do differently.
Absolutely. This drives me nuts. You know what I mean? Because I'm fascinated by people's work and I ask everybody about their workplace and I talk to my friends a lot about it. And, so many people are pissed and you can imagine why, but I think when people think about why people are mad at their jobs, if they're not thinking about their own job, they think that they don't think they're getting paid enough. And it's like, talk to people about why they're mad about their job. And it's like, we could be doing this so much better, and it's driving me insane. And they're pissed about it, and their manager doesn't want to listen, or doesn't care. And it drives me crazy because I see it through an employee ownership lens. You know what I mean? So I'm thinking about it just like your manager. Actually, matter of fact, the owner of that business should be pissed that the manager doesn't care, because that is incredibly useful feedback for their business. And even if it's not, but like just the process of getting feedback and the fact that people are so passionate and that they are going to give you the real answer. And if you sat down and talked to them too, they'll cut out their own bias and whatever BS they had. Because as soon as you sit them down and you're listening, they're only adding that because they're pissed because they're not being listened to. But you sit them down and you're like, oh, I'm actually going to listen to you. They're going to be as reasonable as you could imagine. And like the nugget are ways to improve your business and make it more profitable. And that's the other thing. You talk about employee ownership aha moment. When I say it's like it could work at scale, is because it's competitive, because it can win. And I think I had a sense that like we were doing kind of, that, like I said, this model with like the summer camp and with kind of popular education and different models that kind of come a little bit more out of like social movement and labor history. And it just, we really struggled with a lot of those groups. We got so sick of it, honestly, because it just felt like everybody was just nibbling around the edges and for some reason content to do that. And then the aha moment with employee ownership was like, oh, we can win. We can actually win the entire thing. There are companies in this country that I didn't know about that have 500 employees, and they're millionaire factories for working class people. Like, why is this not happening at scale? And it's really fascinating. We're obsessed with that question. Why is this not happening at scale? You know what I mean? And I think in many ways it's because the employee ownership is not as organized as it could be in this country. Like you have 14 million, unionized workers in this country, and you have around 14 million employee owners. And yet one of those groups sets the entire economic agenda for the Democratic Party. And the other group is just recently kind of getting a representative in the DOL to figure out what ESOP policy is actually at the federal level. Like it's, like there's a missing opportunity here that we want to capitalize and make happen, I think.
First of all, you're absolutely correct. The one thing that I like to share for our listeners generally is, and all of your data was correct, but I just want to add a little color to one part of it. There are approximately 14 million employee owners, but employee ownership is broken up into two parts: privately held companies and publicly held companies. So 3 million or so, approximately, it might be 3.5 million now, are in the privately held companies. And those are the ones that I'm talking to through the podcast that I work with. There are a number of huge like insurance companies that happen to have an ESOP as part of it, and they are counted in some data, but it's just a publicly traded company where it's just one more line on the paycheck. And there isn't the participatory workplace that is also another hallmark of employee ownership. So there are two chains in the Northeast, convenience store chains, Pennsylvania-based, I guess I should say East Coast now, but Wawa's and Sheetz. And it's kind of funny because both are very prominent with lots and lots of stores. But where I live in central Pennsylvania, we are on the edge of Sheetz territory, where up until like this coming year, for 40 years, Sheetz and Wawa have not competed directly head to head. And just now Wawa is coming in.
It's the showdown.
Wawa, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Wawa is, I think, 49% employee owned, and employee ownership is a part of the Wawa vibe. Sheetz has an ESOP but it's just a couple of percentage points that are then given essentially as bonus sharing, which great, but that's not, and even now, I think one of the challenges, forgive me, I feel a really quick soapbox coming on. One of the biggest challenges that I see in employee ownership right now is conflating employee ownership with profit sharing. One of the big folks, KKR, has done a lot of work at employee ownership, which is kind of like, if someone's saying employee ownership, I support that because it makes what I'm doing, so much easier. And by the way, the folks behind that, post something on LinkedIn and they get 15,000 hits. I post on it and I get 15 hits. So I get that they're doing things, but that's just not quite the employee ownership that I'm envisioning. And if people if you can sell the company in 5 years and generate an awful lot of proceeds for the employee owner, again, that's great. But I'm more interested in the employee ownership that is, how do we sustain this for 20, 40, 50 years? How do we keep generations of people being employee owners and not just, boy, at some point there's going to be profit and we can sell it.
Yeah, I am. Absolutely. I think we've been thinking about that same question a lot. And yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think definitely if there are, I feel like I lean towards what you're talking about. And the question specifically of like how to sustain and grow employee ownership is exactly what we concern ourselves with. So just like, I guess for the listener, we're starting the Alabama Center for Employee Ownership to do outreach and education to mostly owners, but also employees about employee ownership, to essentially find and identify people who are going to be interested in transitioning their business to employee ownership. And then with Sand Mountain Cooperative Education Center, we're able to provide assistance with that process. But that is the question we think about, right? Because it is the case that, for every employee-owned business that, transitions, one sells. Right. And so you have a situation where like the employee owners are not growing. And that's when we kind of, for us, we kind of look at the Mondragon model, which is just like, okay, well, how do you use a network effect of employee owned businesses to increase the competitiveness of these businesses, to incentivize the businesses to stay employee owned, right? And I think that for me, it's hard. Maybe there's other great solutions. I think like, obviously, I think there are legislative ones. I think certainly you could create more incentives, I think, to be and stay employee owned. But I think you could also kind of organize employee ownership in the United States so that there's more, I think, benefit to being part of that network, whether that's, training, right? I think when we think about, at least for transitions, what makes them so difficult is a number of things. I think like the laws are not as clear. The process tends to be longer because it involves a ton of training, right, of employees and of owners to understand what's going on. So what would it mean, like, for example, in Mondragon, to have an employee ownership university, right? And it wouldn't have to be exactly that model, but what would it look like if there was so much more cross-pollination with companies exchanging these kinds of practices? Yeah. I imagine you would have a lot more ideas about that, more experience in that world than I do.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the work that you and Daniel and your other, I almost said co-conspirators, your other colleagues.
That works for us. Yeah. We talked about it as a scheme for like 5 years until we realized like, oh my God, it's real.
In England, they're called schemes in the best possible way. Actually, here's our scheme for doing this. And to me, it always throws a little bit. But
schematics. Yeah.
That's right. First of all, got to tell you, when I think 2016, I was a trustee at the time, and my firm was one of the founding members of the Pennsylvania Center for Employee Ownership. And I think that was the third one. Like, Pennsylvania came after Vermont and Ohio, but before EOX came around. Now I think we're at 16 or 18, and I should know the number because I've had just about all of them on the podcast.
We're number 22.
You're number 22. So
yes, we are.
There's a couple of them that have been higher from me. But that, when you had mentioned earlier that, it seems that you were surprised by the lack of organization within ESOP world, et cetera, et cetera. And boy, we've come a long way, in the 15 years that I've been involved in employee ownership. And there is still a lot more to go. But now, as you referenced, the Department of Labor is considering promulgating rules on how to do ESOP transactions, where, for many, many years, they simply made it clear, their guidance, and as a trustee, I had to live with it, but their guidance was essentially, we don't like these, do them at your own peril, and how can we do that? So things are coming along, but there's so many opportunities. And what I love about it is, at a certain point, with Sand Mountain, it would seem to me that, first of all, I think it's really cool that you're educating young people, and employee ownership is kind of alluded to earlier, might be the vehicle that you are using, but you are teaching them skills that transcend employee ownership, and it will make them, honestly, better family members. It will make them better members of their communities, and I don't want to sound silly, but better citizens and just part of the vibe. And that's really important. But there's also, at a certain point, what comes after when they're no longer young. And it strikes me that the Alabama Center, doing what traditionally is done at the state centers, which is educate, potential business owners and work with employee owners as well. And sometime when we're not recording, I'd love to share with you my wish list of things that I think would be really cool that I wish state centers would do.
I would love to hear it. Yeah.
Creating that environment, because if the young people who are leaving the camp in the after school programs age out of your programs and enter the workforce, and they are both mindful of wanting to work for employee-owned companies and also have employee-owned companies to choose from, then you have just done a tremendous service.
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope so. I guess I don't know why I'm saying thank you. It hasn't happened yet, but we're hoping. I think that's exactly what our vision is, and we're starting. So I mean, we've had graduates who now they work with us, right? And we're helping them start, like, for example, a fundraising cooperative, which has some business. And again, I keep citing Mondragon, but the kind of famous line there is like, solve every problem with the cooperative. So we're like, hey, we're having a really hard time with, not a hard time, but like any nonprofit, you struggle with the kind of constant fundraising treadmill, right?
Sure.
So let's find some kids who are interested, train them up, work with the people who would usually do that for us, and now they're doing it. They've won several grants for us, for example, and they operate like employee owners, where they have a say in the structure of the organization and have an equal vote, and everything that entails. So they're practicing it and they're starting it, and that's kind of where we see ourselves going, because I mean, it's like you really have to give even or especially young people that responsibility now, because the success or failure, I think, of the whole project is going to rest on. There's no shortage of work right now. I mean, it's mostly me full-time and then Daniel part-time, and then we have one amazing system of mostly friends and current and former staff members who support us, but most of that is volunteer. And it's been years of volunteer work by incredible and talented people. And yeah, I think the success or failure is really going to rest on these kids. And, right, I feel like we're in good hands.
I think that's great. And I love that you are giving credit to those that are working with you, but credit also to you and Daniel, because somewhere the spark, the idea, the generation of it had to come from somewhere. Will you be affiliated? Will you be an official EOX State Center, or will you be unaffiliated?
Yeah, we're going to be in the EOX State Center. Yes.
Excellent. So you've been working with Steve Storkin and following that through the setup. And where are you? I think not that long from being formally registered.
Yeah, so we got the filing confirmation from the IRS, we got the EIN, so we are, but we're gonna do like a proper launch soon when we finish the website and everything, but give it a month.
That's great. Well, I appreciate your giving an early look at it. And where will the State Center be based? Just as part of where Sand Mountain is, or will you have offices? What are you doing?
So yeah, we'll base the State Center out of Birmingham. So it'll, I'm sure, be my home office for a little bit, but we're looking at, offices and spaces that we could utilize. Yeah. That's where we'll be for the time.
And it's an exciting time. And, through the 7 years of the podcast, every so often, it hasn't come up in a little bit, but every so often I'd have a guest on and we'd lament that, employee ownership isn't really taught at the college level at this point. Business schools don't really talk about employee ownership, and law schools don't really talk about employee ownership. So, we talk about, we need to get employee ownership into the atmosphere more and into academia. And, there's certainly positive things, but teaching it to children and young people, teenagers and whatnot, I just haven't heard that before, dude. So I wanted to come and have the conversation, or have you come on and have the conversation, because I just think that was inspiring. But it also is a, classic sign of do what you know. What do you know? Teaching young people,
So, that's exactly how it started. We were like, we want to start from a position of strength, and we want to start with what the community wants. So we were down there for several years talking to people, and they're like, childcare and transportation. And we're like, we can help with that. And then, we went from there. But also, thank you. Yeah, I do have to, because I agree with the college level. I got to mention one story that is just have to tell. One of our co-founders is from Cairo, and unfortunately, I don't even want to think about it, but unfortunately moving back soon. He lives in New York right now, but he introduced us to a wonderful organization called Tawoon, which creates worker cooperatives all over the Middle East and North Africa. And it's very possible we'll be collabing with them soon. But their director, Mohammed Hakim, when we were talking to him, and we're like, he started like 15 cooperatives across North Africa. Wow. And they're profitable, you know what I mean? And just like amazing things, like we're talking about farmers who create, medicinal, they grow medicinal plants like chamomile, hibiscus, and Hakim organized them into a cooperative, goes to Europe, sells directly to the, cuts out the middleman, and suddenly like you've got Egyptian farmers who run $1 million US.
Wow.
Business, right? So we love them, and it's just like, how did you get so he's a really fascinating model, and he's helped us develop certain ways of like calculating ownership stakes and whatnot for if you're starting a cooperative. And we're like, how did you learn all this and everything? And he was just like, oh, I was really into it, and I went to Denmark and got a degree in cooperative development. Wow. And I was just like, you can do that? Like, just to your point about college level kind of, things in this world. I was like, what?
That is very cool. And there's so much, UK is just the place for employee ownership trusts.
Yes.
Europe, you've mentioned Mondragon a couple of times, and we've had some episodes on Mondragon. I had started, besides this podcast that I host, my friend Jesse Tyler hosts the Owner to Owner podcast. And we, at the same time we launched the Owner to Owner podcast, we had started one on worker cooperatives, and it just never took off. So there were episodes, but it just didn't work. But it's fascinating. And, one of the things that I've always been mindful of is that, I come from the ESOP side. So, even the podcast officially is the ESOP podcast, but we call it the EsOp podcast, and try and talk about cooperatives. But it really is cool for me that, the cooperatives are kind of the purest form of participatory employment, whereas the ESOPs can still be on the corporate side, and where I come from and being comfortable. But boy,
I love that. But I love working with both sides. I mean, you hear that a lot. It's like, do you do co-ops or ESOPs? And we're just like, we don't discriminate. Like, number one, it's gonna, whatever, we're talking about a transition, it's gonna make sense to do the thing that's gonna make the most sense for the business, right?
Right.
And for the employee owners. On the other hand, when we kind of segment these worlds, it's like, that's an enormous amount of business acumen and other knowledge that I think the sides have to benefit. I mean, I'm speaking specifically of working with more, it was my first time in the last several years working with like much more corporate people in the ESOP world. And I'm just like, these people are enormously impressive. I have a ton to learn, so I that's kind of my perspective on where that is.
Well, and it's there's certain fundamental differences. For example, it's just about impossible to have a startup ESOP for all kinds of different reasons. Yeah. And, my first kind of forays into worker cooperatives was, to me, a entry point for employee ownership, even if at some point they grew and became an ESOP. And it was before I was aware enough to, understand that you don't have to transition down the road. But is, I think, something that traditionally hasn't done very well in the ESOP world is, there are significantly more ESOP transactions, ESOP companies than worker cooperatives. And frankly, for all of the complications and the expense of the transactions, you have really talented people who make a good living doing the ESOP transactions and that sort of thing. And it wasn't until the last 10 years or so that there was an understanding that let's talk more about employee ownership generally, so that when we're going to Congress and asking for tax benefits for ESOPs, bring along the co-ops as well, and argue with the Small Business Administration that better rules of credit or what have you for ESOPs should also apply to the co-ops. And I think that that's an area that, again, down the road will be, there will hopefully be more cohesion. But the state centers do a really good job of focusing on that nonpartisan or agnostic, any form of employment is a good form. Kevin, is there anything that you'd like to chat about, any of your endeavors that I didn't give you a chance to?
I feel like I'm very thankful for the opportunity to cover what we are doing, and I'm quite happy that I got to talk about it. Thank you.
Well, Kevin, it's absolutely been my pleasure. I'm so pleased to see the work that you and Daniel are doing. I'm grateful that Haley at Threaded Fasteners introduced us. And if you ever think outside of the recording that I can be helpful in any way or supportive, I hope that you will reach out to me. But we're going to be looking for great news coming out of Alabama, both with the Alabama Center for Employee Ownership that will be officially up and running late spring, early spring of this year. And we'll continue to look for great things out of Sand Mountain. Dude, you're doing innovative, creative, and important work. And I appreciate it. And I'm sure many others are grateful for it as well. So thank you very much.
Well, Brett, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity. Also, I do have to say thank you to Haley again. And yeah, I'm looking forward to, you'll hear from me again. I'm looking forward to more stories.
Excellent. Hashtag Team Haley. With that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the EsOp podcast. My thanks to Kevin Burns, who is the co-founder and director of the Sand Mountain Cooperative Education Center and a co-founder of the soon-to-be Alabama Center for Employee Ownership. And of course, my thanks to you for listening. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at EsOp Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.